Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 21, Section 5, The War Ends. And we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the last few months of the war. We're going to talk about the collapse of the Third Reich, and we're going to talk about the collapse of the Japanese Empire. The Third Reich, as far as we learned in the previous section, we talked about the D-Day invasion. And, we brought in well over 1 million men to kind of start fighting the Nazis in parts of France and eventually into Belgium and the Netherlands and such. Um, in letter A here, as the Americans pushed east towards Germany, Hitler began the last offensive that became known as the Battle of the Bulge. This bulge is actually kind of a bend in the line between the United States and the Nazis. And what's interesting is this is kind of in an area very familiar to American historians. This is in the parts of Belgium in the Ardennes forest. And this is where some of the heaviest fighting of American troops happened during the First World War. But Allied troops kind of were reaching this region about the middle of December 1944. And unfortunately, it was a really awful time when you talk about weather. The temperatures were getting cold. We had a lot of snowfall. And a lot of people were just probably thinking the Germans are going to kind of take it easy, kind of enjoy the holidays a little bit, and then fighting would resume after the beginning of the new year. And as American troops are kind of preparing for Christmas, that is when Germany strikes. And what ends up happening is we have some companies of soldiers that find themselves surrounded by really the last of the full threat of the Nazis. There were tanks, there were lots of troops and such, but because of the weather, it actually did slow the battle down. And there's stories about the fact that soldiers who were wounded didn't bleed out very much because they froze to death before they could bleed out. So it was a very gory period of time. But by the end of January, this offensive was coming to a halt, and the Allies were prevailing over the Nazis. By the end of February 1945, American troops had fought their way to the Rhine River, which is basically the west coast of Germany, if you want to call it like that. It's kind of like Germany's last major defense. After this point in time, we got to think about it in terms of kind of like kind of the circle enclosing on the Germans, because you had the Russians coming from the east, the Allies coming from the west, and what they were doing is cutting Germany off. On May the 7th, 1945, Germany surrenders, and the next day is proclaimed VE Day, Victory in Europe. Kind of leading to that, in late April of 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide as the Russian army is just right outside of Berlin. At the same time, Mussolini, who had been kind of denounced as the leader of Italy during 1943, he is found by Italians and people who were kind of fed up with the war, and eventually he is executed and really um, kind of, I guess you could say, his body was disgraced by Italian citizens who were so angry with him for what they had to live through. Um, Japan. As far as the defeat of Japan, that's going to come several months after VE Day. American military planners were actually planning an invasion of Japan, but that didn't come to fact, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. But we did invade Iwo Jima, which was an island kind of south of the Japanese mainland. The idea was so that the American B-29 bombers, which were our biggest aircraft at that period of time, these were bombers that could fly at very high altitudes. They needed a place that they could refuel before dropping bombs on Japan, and Iwo Jima was a fairly close locality to the Japanese mainland. It would make a perfect refueling site, and so we wanted to gain that. But Iwo Jima was heavily defended. It took uh, far more time than maybe what the Allies had planned for for capturing this island. We had a lot of Marines that died in the process of trying to gain it. Probably the most iconic thing that comes out of this is the image of the flag raisers on the island of Iwo Jima. They're kind of at the top of Mount Suribachi. There's a lot of stories about this photo, whether or not it's a recreation of something that actually happened maybe a day or two before. But needless to say, this is an image that a lot of people are familiar with when they think about World War II. We were also doing the firebombing of Tokyo. If you remember, we talked a little bit about the fact that the Allies had worked together to plan strategic bombings of Germany. Well, we started using that same philosophy on the island of Japan, and we went after Tokyo at the beginning of 1945. We dropped incendiary bombs, which are basically fire bombs, which when they drop, they basically cause fire to break out. You got to understand a lot of the housing that was built in Japan was made out of wood, so it's basically fuel for the fire by all means. And these fires and this type of bombing that went on for many, many weeks killed over 80,000 people, and it destroyed roughly, a quarter of a million buildings within that city. What's interesting is if you look at the numbers, about the same number of people die through these fire bombings that died at Hiroshima. So, I mean, they were very, very awful in the sense of death and destruction and such. But at the same time, it took a long time, several days, to accomplish that in comparison to the lethal blow that an atomic weapon would. Aid to aid a possible invasion of Japan, the United States captured the island of Okinawa. Okinawa is kind of the furthest point south of the Japanese mainland. The island itself, not really big, but it was, again, well armed. And the citizens that live on Okinawa, for the most part, were loyal Japanese citizens. The military there had told the citizens that the United States were evil. And what's sad is as our soldiers are coming upon the island, the number of people that they found that had committed suicide was astronomical. People were throwing themselves off the cliffs and such because they were afraid of being captured by the American monsters, which, is kind of interesting that they would think like that. But needless to say, we were able to capture that island. Even to this day, Okinawa is a strategic military point for the U.S. We have an Air Force base there. We have naval facilities. Certainly, that was a big prize when we were able to take it. The American program to build an atomic bomb. This began really at the onset of World War II. It was known as the Manhattan Project. Some of the work began at the University of Chicago, kind of in the days kind of leading up to the war. But once the war breaks out and the rumors get out that the Nazis are trying to work on an atomic weapon itself, the United States decides that they need to kind of ramp up production here. And so we formed this project, which for the most part was, pretty much top secret. The man that is placed in charge of this is a guy named J. Robert Oppenheimer, the man that you see here with the hat. Oppenheimer was a physicist. He did a lot of work out in Nevada or out in New Mexico. With the whole idea of using science to kind of create this weapon. And eventually they're able to do so. Leo Szilard and Enrique Fermi, they built the world's first, we'll try this again, the world's first nuclear reactor at the University of Chicago. The story is that University of Chicago at one point in time had a football team that wasn't very good, and what these men did is they used the facility underneath pretty much the grandstands there of the football field to build this reactor. And probably because nobody would probably be watching any football and caring about it. But needless to say, they built this. There was also support from guys like Albert Einstein that they needed to do this in order to beat the Nazis to it. And we built this weapon. Okay, there were a lot of people throughout the United States that were working on the Manhattan Project that probably didn't even know what they were working on. We tested the first atomic bomb in July of 1945 out in New Mexico. That was a success, and eventually we're able to send 2 weapons to the Pacific that we're going to be able to use against Japan. And letter F, the Allies threatened Japan with what we would call prompt and utter destruction if the nation did not surrender unconditionally. The Japanese refused to do so. They didn't reply. And so on August 6th, we dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. And within a few days, when we didn't hear any more from the Japanese, we dropped another atomic weapon on the city of Nagasaki on August the 9th. It's after that the Japanese make contact, and they are asking for an opportunity to surrender on August the 15th. Okay, shortly after those dropping the bombs, the Soviets decide that they're going to join in so that they can get a little bit of piece of the prize, I guess, of the far Pacific. But Japan officially surrenders on September 1st, 1945. When the war ends, there's some concern about building a new world. President Roosevelt, before he leaves office, when he passes away in April of 1945, believed a new international political organization could prevent another world war. And so he, and along with our Prime Minister Winston Churchill, they start putting the ideas together for a United Nations. This comes out of the Yalta Conference that happens at the beginning of 1945. And eventually, the first meeting of the UN is going to take place in the fall of 1945 in San Francisco. Also in that year, we're going to have our first international military tribunal, or AKA the Nuremberg trials. What we wanted to do is to put leaders of the Nazi Party who were suspected of committing war crimes, primarily the deaths of individuals in the extermination camps and the treatment of prisoners of war and such. We wanted to put them on trial, and so we were able to do so. The Allies also did not want to put the Emperor of Japan on trial because they didn't want to have an uprising of the Japanese, but they did hold tribunals in Japan. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo would eventually be put on trial in a military tribunal and found guilty and executed for his participation in atrocities against Allied soldiers and peoples of conquered nations. Thank you very much.